Imagine pouring your blood, your sweat, and every ounce of your sanity into building the ultimate racing machine, only to have the officials look at it, turn pale, and immediately rewrite the rulebook just to ensure your tires never touch their track. I want you to picture the scene. The air is thick with the smell of unburned high-octane fuel and burning rubber. The crowd is deafening. But down in the staging lanes, there is absolute silence around one specific car. The officials are staring at it, not with admiration, but with genuine, unadulterated fear. This was a car that didn't just bend the rules. It took the rulebook, tore it to shreds, and set it on fire in front of the establishment. I promise you, by the end of this video, you will understand exactly why the National Hot Rod Association panicked. You will see how one group of brilliant, rebellious minds found a secret door in the regulations and built something so terrifyingly fast, so completely unnatural, that it was banned before it could even complete lap 1. And I promise you this too, once you hear this story, you will never look at modern drag racing the same way again. The cars you see today, the ones that shatter eardrums and break the laws of physics, owe their entire existence to the machine we are about to uncover. This is the story of the 1965 Altered Wheelbase Mopars. This is the story of the day the engineers declared war on the establishment. To truly understand why this terrifying machine was forged, you have to transport yourself back to the sheer desperation of the early 1960s. The American drag strip was not just a place for weekend entertainment, it was a vicious, high-stakes battlefield. The phrase, "win on Sunday, sell on Monday," was not just a catchy marketing slogan, it was a literal, cutthroat business strategy for the big Detroit automakers. If your brand was losing at the track, you were bleeding millions of dollars in the showrooms. For a long time, the Chrysler Corporation, heavily backing the Dodge and Plymouth brands, felt confident. But the landscape of speed was shifting violently. Ford had just unleashed the Thunderbolt, a stripped-down, brutally lightened Fairlane packed with a massive 427 cubic-inch engine. Pontiac and Chevrolet were bringing their own monsters to the fight, with lightweight aluminum body panels and massive displacement blocks. The NHRA Superstock and Factory Experimental classes, the most prestigious categories where cars were supposed to closely resemble the vehicles everyday people could buy off the dealership lot, were becoming an uncontrollable arms race. Chrysler knew that simply adding more horsepower was no longer the answer. They had the power, but they were losing the war on the pavement. They had the legendary 426 cubic-inch Hemi engine, a masterpiece of brute mechanical force that would go down in history as the elephant engine. If you were to look at a detailed cutaway of this 1960s mechanical marvel, you would see the massive hemispherical combustion chambers that allowed for enormous valves, incredible airflow, and a terrifying compression ratio. This era was a golden age of mechanical outlaws. While brilliant minds were down south figuring out how to build engines that bent every stock car oval track regulation with genius fluid dynamics and hidden innovations, the drag racing world had its own breed of mad scientists. The Hemi produced ungodly amounts of torque, but all that power was absolutely useless if the rear tires just spun helplessly into white smoke on the cold asphalt. The factory Dodges and Plymouths were heavy, front-heavy beasts. The engineers realized a fundamental truth of automotive physics. To win, they didn't just need to push the car forward, they needed to violently force the tires down. They needed traction. They needed the ultimate weight transfer. And they were willing to do whatever it took to get it, even if it meant creating a mechanical abomination. In a secretive workshop, far away from the prying eyes of the public, rival factory spies, and the strict scrutiny of the racing officials, a group of Chrysler's most brilliant engineering minds gathered around a drafting table. They were not looking at engine blocks, carburetors, or exhaust headers. They were intensely, obsessively studying the NHRA Rulebook. They read every single line, every comma, every obscure stipulation regarding what defined a factory experimental car. They were looking for a crack in the armor, a shadow they could hide a monster inside. And right there, hidden in the dense bureaucratic text, they found it. A tiny, almost invisible loophole. The rule stated that a car's wheelbase could be altered to improve traction, but the language was vague. It did not explicitly cap the exact percentage or stipulate the relationship between the wheels and the original factory body lines. The engineers realized that if they took the factory experimental class rules to their absolute most literal, twisted interpretation, they could fundamentally change the entire geometry of the vehicle. They decided to stop trying to make a heavy, clumsy streetcar act like a race car. Instead, they would build a pure, unadulterated racing chassis and disguise it in the stretched, distorted skin of a streetcar. The plan was sheer, unadulterated madness, a rebellion disguised as legal compliance. They took a batch of brand new 1965 Dodge Coronets and Plymouth Belvederes and began a mechanical surgery so extreme it looked like something out of a science fiction nightmare. They didn't just tweak the suspension geometry or bolt on some aftermarket traction bars. They cut the floor pans wide open with cutting torches, showering the garage in sparks and the smell of melting sheet metal. They unbolted the entire rear axle assembly, the massive, heavy-duty Dana 60 rear end, and violently shoved it forward by a staggering 15 inches. Then, they moved the front K-member and the front wheels forward by an additional 10 inches. By moving the wheels so drastically forward relative to the body of the car, they fundamentally shifted the vehicle's entire center of gravity. If you were to peel back the body panels and look at a cutaway of this new chassis, you would see a machine designed solely to manipulate physics. When the driver slammed the throttle wide open, the massive rotational torque of the 426 Hemi wouldn't just spin the rear tires, it would violently rotate the entire chassis backward, planting nearly 100% of the engine's massive weight directly over the rear axle. It was the absolute perfection of launch physics, a mechanical lever designed to completely crush the competition off the starting line. But the engineers didn't stop at just altering the wheelbase. They knew that static weight was the ultimate enemy of speed, the invisible force holding them back from total domination. So, they stripped the cars down to their barest, most essential bones. The heavy steel front fenders, the massive steel hood, the doors, the heavy chrome bumpers, and even the steel dashboard were unceremoniously ripped off and thrown in the scrap pile. In their place went impossibly thin, incredibly fragile fiberglass components. They removed the heavy factory glass windows and replaced them with flexible, lightweight Lexan plastic. But even that wasn't enough for these madmen. To shed even more pounds, the engineers went to such extremes that they utilized the highly toxic, incredibly dangerous process called acid dipping. They would literally submerge the remaining steel body shell in a massive chemical bath, allowing the corrosive acids to eat away at the metal for hours until it was as thin as a sheet of newspaper. The chemical fumes would burn your eyes, and the process compromised the entire structural integrity of the car, but the results on the scale were undeniable. If you leaned too hard against the roof of one of these acid-dipped cars, it would dent permanently. The final product weighed hundreds of pounds less than a standard production car, with a weight distribution so heavily biased to the rear that it looked like it was permanently squatting on its haunches, a predator ready to pounce on its prey. When these heavily modified cars were finally rolled out of the secretive workshops and into the daylight, they looked profoundly wrong. Because the wheels were no longer centered inside the factory wheel wells, the cars possessed an awkward, distorted, almost comical appearance. The massive rear slick tires sat entirely too far forward, positioned right behind the driver's seat, while the front tires were pushed way out toward the nose of the car. They didn't look like the elegant, powerful muscle cars sitting on the dealership showroom floors. They looked like mechanical freaks, cartoonish exaggerations of speed. People who saw them during private testing sessions actually laughed out loud. They pointed at the ridiculous stance and immediately dubbed them funny cars because of their bizarre, altered proportions. But the Chrysler engineers didn't care one bit about making something beautiful or aesthetically pleasing. They only cared about making a weapon. They knew exactly what this bizarre machine was mathematically capable of, and they were ready to unleash it on the unsuspecting world of the National Hot Rod Association. The drivers selected for this dangerous mission were legends in their own right, men constructed of pure nerve and lightning-fast reflexes. Men like the cigar-chomping Dick Landy, the brilliant engineers of the Ramchargers team, and the fearless Sox and Martin duo. These drivers understood that getting behind the wheel of one of these altered wheelbase monsters wouldn't just be a test of racing skill, it would be a test of sheer, unadulterated bravery. The car was wildly, terrifyingly unstable at high speeds. Because the front wheels had almost no weight pressing them down onto the tarmac, steering was almost entirely non-existent. The front tires would essentially skim the surface of the track, completely useless for directional control. It was less like driving an automobile and more like trying to aim a fired cannonball while strapped to the side of a solid rocket booster. Every single run down the quarter mile was a delicate dance with disaster, requiring the driver to steer with the throttle and pray that the crosswinds didn't blow them directly into the concrete retaining walls. The absolute moment of truth finally arrived under the bright, unforgiving sun of California at the 1965 NHRA Winternationals. The atmosphere was electric, tense with anticipation. The Chrysler teams rolled their massive transport rigs into the crowded pits, keeping the doors locked, deliberately hiding the monsters inside from the prying eyes of their rivals. When the time finally came, when they dropped the heavy steel ramps and slowly backed the altered wheelbase, Dodges and Plymouths out into the sunlight, the entire drag strip seemed to stop dead in its tracks. The laughter that had echoed during the private testing sessions was nowhere to be found here. The other racers, the men who had been dominating the class in their heavy, conventional Fords and Chevrolets, looked at the Mopars with a creeping, icy sense of dread. They could clearly see the massive, wrinkling wall rear slicks tucked weirdly into the forward-shifted rear-wheel wells. They could see the impossibly thin fiberglass hoods shaking violently from the aggressive, uneven idle of the fuel-injected Hemi engines. These cars sounded fundamentally different than anything else on the property. It wasn't just a loud exhaust, it was an angry, staccato mechanical violence that vibrated right through the chest cavity of anyone standing within 100 feet. It was the sound of thousands of controlled explosions echoing through paper-thin steel pipes. The rival drivers knew immediately and instinctively that they were looking at their own obsolescence. They were looking at the extinction of the conventional muscle car as a drag racing platform. But no one on the entire property was more alarmed, more deeply concerned than the NHRA tech inspectors. These were the men tasked with keeping the sport fair, keeping the cars relatively close to their factory origins, and most importantly, keeping the sport from devolving into a lethal free-for-all. When the group of inspectors, armed with clipboards and measuring tapes, walked up to the Chrysler pit area, the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. The showdown between the outlaw engineers and the establishment had officially begun. While the drag strips of America were being torn apart by the violent, nitro-burning rebellion of the funny cars, an entirely different kind of war was brewing down south. If the quarter mile was a battle of brute force and shifting weight, the high-speed banked ovals of NASCAR were a battle of sustained endurance, aerodynamics, and pure, unadulterated cunning. The executives in suits who wrote the rulebooks thought they had every possible angle covered. They sent out inspectors with templates, measuring tapes, and strict guidelines to ensure every car that rolled onto the track was exactly what it was supposed to be, a stock automobile. But they grossly underestimated the mind of a mechanic who operated out of a garage in Daytona Beach, Florida. A man who didn't just read the rulebook, he held it up to the light to see what was written in the shadows. This is the story of the man they called the absolute master of the unfair advantage. This is the story of Smokey Yunick, his legendary Chevelle, and the terrifying, mythical piece of hardware known simply as the Mystery Engine. I promise you, by the time this video is over, you will realize that the greatest racing victories aren't won on the asphalt. They are won in the garage, late at night, by outsmarting every single official in the room. To understand the absolute genius of what happened, you have to look at the atmosphere of 1960s stock car racing. The manufacturers were pouring millions of dollars into their racing programs. Chevrolet, Ford, and Chrysler were engaged in a bitter, high-speed arms race. But NASCAR was desperately trying to keep the speeds down and the cars somewhat identical to what the public was driving. They instituted strict rules on engine displacement, body dimensions, and fuel capacity. For most mechanics, the rulebook was a solid brick wall. For Smokey Yunick, it was a piece of Swiss cheese. Smokey operated the best damn garage in town, and his philosophy was simple. If the rulebook doesn't explicitly say you cannot do something, then it is absolutely mandatory that you do it. He wasn't just building cars, he was building mechanical illusions. And his magnum opus was a black and gold Chevelle, that would make the NASCAR inspection team question their own sanity. Let us pull back the curtain And look at the beating heart of this mechanical rebellion. The legendary 1960s NASCAR mystery engine. If you were to look at a highly detailed cinematic cutaway of this specific power plant, it wouldn't look like a standard production block. It was the Chevrolet 427 cubic inch Mark II, a porcupine head big block that was so secretive, Chevrolet didn't even want the public to know it existed yet. Smokey got his hands on it and immediately began working dark magic. Looking at the cutaway, you would see how he perfectly polished the intake runners to a mirror finish, manipulating fluid dynamics so the air and fuel mixture didn't just flow into the combustion chambers, it was violently accelerated. You would see the custom-machined pistons and the precisely balanced crankshaft that allowed this massive block of iron to scream at RPM levels that would shatter a normal engine into shrapnel. But having the most powerful engine in the world didn't matter if the car pushing the wind was a giant brick. Smokey knew that on the massive superspeedways of Daytona and Talladega, aerodynamic drag was the ultimate enemy. And the rulebook strictly stated that the car's body could not be altered from the factory dimensions. So, Smokey Yunick didn't alter the dimensions. He altered the entire reality of the car. When he rolled his Chevelle into the inspection bay, it looked like a standard Chevrolet. But to the naked eye, something was just slightly imperceptibly off. It just looked incredibly fast while sitting completely still. The inspectors walked around it, scratching their heads. They placed their official factory templates over the roof, the hood, and the trunk. Miraculously, every single template fit perfectly. The curves matched, the length matched. The officials were baffled, but they had to pass the body. What they didn't realize, and what wouldn't be discovered until years later, was a feat of engineering so audacious it borders on fiction. Smokey hadn't just lowered the car or chopped the roof, he had literally built a 7/8 scale replica of a Chevelle. He had taken a brand new body and meticulously cut, channeled, and re-welded every single square inch of the sheet metal to make the entire car proportionally smaller, cutting through the air like a bullet instead of a brick. The reason the templates fit was because Smokey had snuck into the inspection area weeks earlier, studied the templates, and built the car to match the templates exactly, while completely ignoring the actual factory dimensions. He didn't build a car for the track, he built a car specifically to beat the inspection tools. But the illusions didn't stop at the aerodynamics. NASCAR had very strict rules regarding how much fuel a car could carry. The fuel cell in the trunk was highly regulated, and the inspectors measured it meticulously to ensure no one had an extra drop of high-octane racing gas. More fuel meant fewer pit stops, and fewer pit stops meant winning races. The inspectors checked Smokey's fuel tank, measured its precise volume, and gave it the green light. It was exactly the legal limit. What the inspectors failed to notice, however, was the fuel line running from the tank in the back of the car all the way to the massive mystery engine in the front. A standard fuel line is about half an inch in diameter. Smokey had installed a coiled, massive 2-inch diameter pipe that wound its way through the chassis of the car before finally reaching the carburetor. That oversized, incredibly long fuel line secretly held an additional 5 gallons of racing fuel. While the other teams were forced to dive into the pits, screaming for gas, Smokey's driver stayed out on the track, turning blistering laps, fueled by the invisible gasoline hidden entirely within the plumbing of the car. It was brilliant, it was completely illegal in spirit, and it was technically never mentioned in the rulebook. The confrontations between Smokey Yunick and the NASCAR inspection officials became legendary theater. The inspectors knew he was cheating, they just couldn't figure out how. They would tear his car apart, looking for the hidden nitrous oxide bottles, the oversized engines, or the illegal suspension modifications. On one incredibly famous occasion, the inspectors were crawling all over his car, completely frustrated. They had pulled the gas tank entirely out of the vehicle to inspect it, leaving it sitting on the concrete floor of the garage. One of the officials looked at Smokey, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and angrily listed off 10 different things that were wrong with the car, telling him the car was disqualified and he couldn't race. Smokey, with his trademark cowboy hat pulled low and a cigar clenched firmly in his teeth, didn't argue. He didn't yell. He simply calmly got into the driver's seat of the disqualified car, fired up the massive, roaring mystery engine, put the transmission into gear, and drove the car right out of the inspection bay and back to his garage. The inspectors stood there in absolute stunned silence. The car had no gas tank. It was sitting right there on the floor in front of them. Smokey had driven away entirely on the 5 gallons of fuel hidden within the massive coiled fuel line. It was the ultimate mic drop in the history of motorsport, a visual middle finger to the establishment that proved he was always 3 steps ahead. The legacy of the mystery engine and the scaled-down Chevelle is not a story of a mechanic who broke the rules to steal a trophy. It is the story of a visionary who viewed the rulebook as an intellectual challenge. Smokey Yunick forced NASCAR to evolve. Every time they wrote a new rule to stop him, they had to hire smarter inspectors, build better templates, and tighten up their technical knowledge. The heavily regulated, highly scrutinized, multi-billion-dollar stock cars of today are a direct result of the governing body desperately trying to catch up to the ghost of Smokey Yunick. He proved that horsepower alone does not win championships. Championships are won by the men who understand fluid dynamics better than the factory engineers, who understand aerodynamics better than the wind tunnel technicians, and who understand human psychology well enough to make an inspector look directly at a shrunken car and see a full-sized automobile. He was an outlaw in a cowboy hat armed with a welding torch and a terrifying intellect. When we look back at the golden era of 1960s racing, whether it was the altered wheelbase funny cars tearing up the drag strips or Smokey Chevelle dominating the oval tracks, a common thread emerges. It was an era of unchecked human ingenuity. It was a time before computers and laser scanners dictated what could and could not be built. It was a time when a man could walk into a garage with a wild idea, cut a car in half, and roll out a machine that terrified the world. These vehicles were rolling testaments to rebellion. They carried the dreams of mad scientists, the rebellion of the outlaw drivers, and the history of an entire sport inside their heavily modified chassis. They remind us that the greatest leaps forward in performance never come from the center of the pack. They always come from the absolute fringes, from the minds of the people who are told their ideas are impossible, dangerous, and illegal. If you crave these untold stories of mechanical outlaws and the engines that shook the world, then you have found your home. From the secret cutaway details of legendary engines to the forgotten classics that rewrote the rulebooks of racing, we bring the golden age of horsepower back to life. Do not let the story end here. Hit that subscribe button, join our crew of hardcore gearheads, and get ready for the next ride. Because the race never really ends, the rules just get harder to break. See you in the next video.